Greetings and Happy New Year. We've entered the year of the snake, the wood snake. It's my year. I was born in the year of the snake. I was born Earth Snake, right on the cusp of the dragon. I was almost a dragon, but turned into the year of the snake. Anyone born in 1989, after like February after February, they're all in the year of the snake. So this video, I'm still here at Castle Stark at OG Foundation in Of-Allodium. And this video, I'm going to tell you a story about the greatest American hero that you've never heard of. There's a few people who will have heard of him, but most of you will have never heard of the great John Stark, who Starksboro, the neighboring town that we're just outside of, is named after. And also that Castle Stark here is named after. What do you think about that, Benedict? He thinks it's a good idea. Yeah, let's talk about General Stark. Where do we begin? I just finished reading 2 books about General Stark, and I started the 3rd, and I've ordered a 4th. And they all start at the beginning, talking about where he was born, where he came from, his parents, his early life. But that would be too boring to start at the start, so I want to start somewhere else. So I'll start with the summary. The summary is that Vermont wouldn't exist without the great John Stark, and the United States in its current form would not exist without John Stark. The U.S. Rangers, or the Army Rangers, they probably wouldn't exist without John Stark. And the flag that is the icon of this channel would not exist without John Stark. So we'll start with the flag. So I had previously thought that the flag, the all green forest green flag with the 13 stars on, white stars on blue in the canton in the top left, I always thought that was the Green Mountain Boy flag. But come to learn later on, and I didn't even know that Starksboro was named after John Stark. I didn't know anything about him up until a couple years ago. And why is it that you don't know anything about him when he's the greatest American hero? Well, there's a whole rabbit hole. There's a whole story to get into. But first I've got to tease you with why you should be interested in this story. Why should you be interested? Well, you know all about George Washington, and you probably know about like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams or something like that. They're called the Founding Fathers. Well, they were nothing compared to John Stark. We'll start there. So George Washington, you know, the whole myth is that he's this infallible hero, general, genius, great president. Well, did you know that he single-handedly was the cause of the 7 Years' War? George Washington. He ambushed a troop of French soldiers who were guard to a French ambassador delivering him a note. He had previously delivered a note to the French in the Ohio Valley saying, hey, y'all quit being there and stuff. We of the Virginia clan now claim the Ohio River. So everything in the original colonies was all based on maritime law. So all of the original colonies, they're all at the mouth of a river, and then the territory of that colony extends to the watershed of that river. And so the British colonized the east coast, while the French colonized the Lawrence River, or whatever it's called, you know, that big river, and then the Louisiana River, New Orleans, the big river. So by all right, the French had right to the Ohio River Valley, but the British and George Washington at that time, he was appointed by the dimwit Virginia colony governor. Hey, get out! No, bad goat, gonna mess up my shot here. So anyways, basically George Washington, after having delivered a note to these French people, he didn't deliver it to the right people, not the commanding officer. He was just like, get out of there, you Frenchies. And then the French sent a note back. But what did George Washington do? He just ambushed their diplomatic delegation and killed them and took them prisoner without any warning, without even an attempt to just have them surrender. He ambushed them when the British and the French were not at war, and killed the commander, or his Indians did, who were under his command. And that was the start of the 7 Years' War. So George Washington, and then in his report, George Washington is like, y'all need to pay me more. I'm not getting paid enough. I should get a raise. Y'all need to pay me more. So that was why the 7 Years' War started. You probably don't know much about the 7 Years' War, but this is when John Stark has his rise to glory and fame and greatness. And he wasn't alone. He was one of the founding members of Rogers Rangers, along with Robert Rogers, who was his neighbor in New Hampshire, where his family settled and the Rogers family settled. And they basically pioneered the Rangers and guerrilla warfare in America, and they beat the French and the Indians by being better attuned to the land and fighting smarter. And basically, this whole 7 Years' War is mostly based around the Lake Champlain. So as we get to the maritime law and the waterways, Lake Champlain is this really strategic place geographically, where it's part of the St. Lawrence watershed. So the French basically had the rights, relative to European crown law, to sort of colonize, but the French weren't so much about colonizing. They more like built alliances with the native Indians and then traded with them for furs and other things. And then they like built forts. So the French had control of the Lake Champlain watershed, essentially, which includes Lake George. And most of the 7 Years' War and General Stark's rise, he starts as a lieutenant in the Rogers Rangers, third in command, and one of the founding members of Rogers Rangers. And him and Robert and the other Rangers, they had all sorts of engagements up and down Lake George and Lake Champlain, and Fort Ticonderoga is basically the center point of the fortifications for the French at Lake Champlain, but also Crown Point. And let's see, how can I tell this story in a way that's very interesting and exciting that you actually care about? Well, let's talk about the American Revolution, because most of you don't care about the 7 Years' War. Just that he had his rise and his experience and everything in the 7 Years' War. He was probably the most experienced Ranger aside from Robert Rogers, the original founder of the Rangers. And Robert's brother was in the Rangers, William, I think. And then John Stark's brother, John's brother's name is William. Robert's brother's name is Richard, maybe? I don't know. But basically, Robert Stark, when it comes to the Revolutionary War, so they were all fighting for the British in the 7 Years' War. Then when it gets to the Revolutionary War, Robert Rogers turns into a traitor and goes to the British side. And then John's brother, William, also becomes a traitor and goes to the British side. But John Stark is basically the one founder of the Rangers that stayed loyal to America, not a British colonial subject. Oh, good, it's still going. So, in the Revolutionary War, basically the Americans, they were a bunch of ragtag rebels, upstart patriot people. They didn't really have a organized army, militia. They started drilling their militia for some years as the tensions were building up with the British, and then the first kind of battles kind of ensued at like Lexington and Concord when the British went inland to try to capture some garrison or some stores and stuff. And so that was the first engagements. And right after that, the people were like, "Oh, it's on. The British are fighting us, and we've been drilling our militia, and we're just gonna respond." So they respond to Boston, and John Stark comes down out of New Hampshire with basically like 1,000 other people, roughly, or more, maybe 1,400 or something. And he's basically the de facto leader of all the local militia that just rise at Boston. But no one really knows what they're doing other than him. There's some other people who were rangers and who had a little bit of experience in the 7 Years' War, but none compared to John Stark. And so he was the original leader of the, what you could call, the Continental Army, which the Gadsden flag, if you're aware of the Gadsden flag, the yellow flag with the rattlesnake, don't tread on me, that's the flag of the Continental Army. That's the symbol that represents American patriots. Those who are essentially sovereign of themselves and reject foreign overlordship. So basically there was a ragtag group of rebels, and John Stark basically organizes them and drives the British provisions. They set up a siege around Boston, drive their animals off of the local island so that the British don't have food to keep them garrisoned or whatever. And then at Bunker Hill, which is the first big battle, which is actually Breed's Hill, where the Continental Army, the new Continental Army, but it's really just a group of militia, but they're all united basically under John Stark, essentially. They go and fortify a hill. They wanted to go to Bunker Hill, but they went to Breed's Hill because they didn't know what they were doing. That was before John Stark arrived. And then he shows up to the scene, and they're like in disarray, and they've got holes in their lines. And so John Stark comes up and gets them all aligned, and then knows where the British are going to come, and he gets a good line and is like, goes out and puts his stick in the ground and is like, don't fire until they're like right here when they march up the hill. And the British land, and they march up the hill, and they just mow down these redcoats, these militia under the leadership of John Stark. And then they send another wave, and they mow down the redcoats. And then they send another wave, and they mow down the redcoats. They don't have a lot of supplies, though. So they basically, at this point, are out of ammunition. So rather than... and some of the positions had started to get overrun. And so he did an orderly retreat of their troops from there. And essentially, they retreated from the train, but they killed twice as many redcoats as they lost. As a local, untrained, unorganized, well, they were kind of trained and kind of organized, but mostly inexperienced militia, they inflicted death 2-1 against the redcoats. So that was his first kind of battle against the British, and that was the first major battle overall of the colonials against the British, and it was basically a victory, even though they gave up the hill. It was basically a tactical victory as far as how many British were lost versus the colonials, and they didn't rout or anything. There was an organized pullback, and that was the first example of John Stark's leadership of the Continental Army. At this point, you're losing a little bit of interest. So, otherwise, the colonials, so the Continental Congress elects Washington right away. He says he'll be the commanding general because he commanded the Virginia people under Dimwitty, and his name's Dimwittle, but he's a dimwit because it was Washington and Dimwit conspiring to cause the whole 7 Years' War, and they were indirectly basically responsible for like 1 million deaths in they're for-profit. They just formed a company between Washington and Dimwit and some other aristocrats, and they were just gonna claim the land and sell the land for profit. And so all these people died because of Washington conspiring with these British aristocrats and whatnot. So the Congress obviously puts everything the Congress does, the new Congress, is basically wrong and is stupid. And so they put Washington in charge, and so instead of John Stark being in charge, in comes all these other people who don't know what they're doing, who don't have decades of experience in American warfare. Well, Washington had some, but nothing in comparison to John Stark. So basically, they lose a bunch of engagements. Almost every engagement that Washington is in, he just loses one after the other. And in contrast, John Stark wins every engagement. He is like the winning force, and Washington is like the losing force. Washington shows up with his slave and all his prim and proper clothes, and he's like, these New Englanders, they look dirty and ragged. But the dirty and ragged New Englanders were the people who showed up, who fought successfully, and who weren't the slave owners, who weren't all prim and proper. Though Richard Rogers' family, I guess, maybe had some slaves or something. Or no, maybe not them, maybe Molly Stark's parents did. But we're not talking about Molly Stark yet. So it could be called a loss at Boston, because basically they surrendered the territory, but they maintained the siege. And now we're going to jump ahead to Fort Ticonderoga, which is the essential fort that's controlling Lake Champlain. Fort Ticonderoga and then Crown Point as well. But Ticonderoga is like bigger, more developed and everything. So in 1775, on May 5th, or is it May 10th? Oh boy, I should know this. I think it's May 10th actually. Could be May 5th. Anyways, one of those days in 1775, the Green Mountain Boys, the militia of Vermont, they storm fight Fort Ticonderoga. And in a flawless victory, they capture it with no losses, and they capture all the cannon at Fort Ticonderoga under the command of Ethan Allen, under the authority of the Great Jehovah. And then Seth Warner, one of the second in command, basically, of the Green Mountain Boys, then captures Crown Point, the other main fort on Lake Champlain. So the Green Mountain Boys, the militia of Vermont, they basically claim Lake Champlain as the territory, or the authority over the waterway, the maritime claim of Lake Champlain, on behalf of Vermont. They're the militia of Vermont, which at this time is not part of the 13 colonies, the Continental Congress. Vermont had been at war with the colony of New York, which claimed all of Vermont, and so Vermont was already in an ongoing war for their own independence before the rest of the colonies had their war of independence. But they had common cause because they shared the same enemy, being the British. So when the other colonies finally rose to rebellion, like the Vermonters had already done, they were basically natural allies. And so that was the first major win of the Revolutionary War, was the Green Mountain Boys. And then, because of the artillery that they capture at Fort Ticonderoga, they take that down, Henry Knox does, to Boston. And then that's how they get the British to surrender Boston, is by the artillery gained by the Green Mountain Boys from Fort Ticonderoga. They put it on the heights, and then the British retreat from Boston. So that's the second major victory in the Revolutionary War, is that the British retreated from one of the main cities, one of the stars of the 13 stars that controlled a major waterway, and Boston was one of the main cities. So the British were not happy about this at all. Not at all. And so at the end of the 7 Years' War, the British captured Canada from the French. So at this point, Canada, and the St. Lawrence waterway, which was French, at this point it's British. And the British are like, they develop a strategy. They're going to divide the colonial forces all via Lake Champlain and then the Hudson River. So they decide to kind of come down the Hudson River Valley from Canada, and then come down Lake Champlain, and then go up the Hudson River Valley in a tri-prong attack to divide what they saw as the most rebellious part of the colonials was New England, of largely New Hampshire and Massachusetts and the other states. Some people will say Vermont is part of New England, but really it's not, because New England is all of these colonies of Great Britain in the watershed on the Atlantic, whereas Vermont has a different heritage. It's landlocked relative to the Atlantic, and then its watershed goes up to the St. Lawrence. And it started out as French, and then it was at war with the British before the other ones, so it had the least affiliation with England. Vermont is a state created by the authority of the local people out of a territory that was claimed by... Oh man, we're losing data. Okay, I'm back. I just had to delete some videos to make room for more videos. So, I forget exactly where I ended, but the important point that I think I was just making is that Vermont was claimed by New York. Legally, New York had the claim of Vermont relative to the pre-existing legal system, relative to Britain and whatever. And the origin of Vermont is that the Vermonters rejected the authority of that legal claim of the crown, and they created their own state, Vermont, by their own authority, by the authority of the people from the bottom up versus from the top down of the crown. Instead of the singular sovereign of the crown ruling over everyone else, the multitude, the people, being sovereign and of their authority, creating the state of Vermont. So that is the winning ideology and what America is all about. And because they had the right ideology and they have the right alignment, they prevail flawlessly at Ticonderoga and Crown Point, and they capture all the British and they capture all the artillery. So we're getting up to the greatest moment of glory for John Stark. This is all the background of it, essentially. So the British, in retaliation for that, they realize how important Lake Champlain and the Hudson River Valley is, so they have this whole strategy of attacking from three sides under General Burgoyne, or however you pronounce his silly British name. It sounds kind of French, actually, Burgoyne or something. So the British, with a bunch of Hessian mercenaries, who through other scholarship, it turns out that the Rothschilds are the reason that the British got all these Hessian mercenaries, because the Rothschilds were in control of the British crown, the central bankers, and they wanted to ensure their control over the colonies as well, and to repay the debts that the British had gotten into debt to the Rothschilds for. They wanted to make sure that the British could repay that debt by extracting the money from the colonials. So the force of the British overlords with a lot of these German mercenaries on behalf of the Rothschilds were coming to subdue the revolutionary Americans and Vermonters. So, three-prong attack, and the middle prong of it is coming down Lake Champlain, and essentially they take Crown Point back, and they take Fort Ticonderoga back because they weren't in Vermont control. Vermont had given it up to the Continentals, and they were pretty much all incompetent, and John Stark wasn't there. They gave command to somebody else who was incompetent, some lawyer probably, or someone with no real experience. And so they surrendered both forts, basically without a fight. But it was actually a decent strategy because the British didn't have the best supply lines. And so, meanwhile, the Vermonters had set up a commonwealth. They were pooling their resources to support the militia, and they sent their food and armaments and their extra supplies and whatnot down to Bennington in southwestern Vermont, which was originally created by the governor of New Hampshire, which was part of the reason why Vermont was at war with New York before the rest of the colonials were at war with the British, because the British were incompetent and they messed up. Because Vermont is this whole territory that's going up to the watershed of Lake Champlain, there was a dispute between New York and New Hampshire, with the Hudson and then the Connecticut River, about who had the authority. So first the New Hampshire guy of Wentworth, Bennington, was selling the lots And then later the New York guy complained, and then he won for the British crown. And then so the New Yorkers were like, all right, all you people here in what became Vermont, you don't own your land. Now you have to pay us. You have to pay twice for what you already have settled. And the Vermonters were like, no, we already are here, and we're not going to accept that. So they chase out the sheriffs and the posses and the Germans and whoever the British send to try to subjugate the Vermonters to the New York ruler. And the Vermonters are having none of it. So the incompetent colonials, they lose Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. And then the British are down at the bottom of Lake Champlain, bottom of Lake George, and they're basically out of supplies. And then they hear about, there's this huge supply depot in Vermont, in Bennington. And so they send their a large detachment of their forces and a lot of the Germans there to steal and pillage the property of Vermont again. But the Vermonters are already well aware of this. They're already basically hardened to this warfare with the British. And so, but at the same time, the Green Mountain Boys, they only had about like 300, 400 maybe troops. And they're facing an invasion force of like 1,000 or roughly. And so they appealed to New Hampshire for support. And so I'm getting into this whole story, but I forgot a big thing about John Stark. So now we'll go back to John Stark. So, I'm having trouble keeping this going. There's a lot there, though. Forgive me. Hopefully I maintain your interest through this whole story. So, John Stark, being the most experienced leader in the Continental Army, demonstrating his effectiveness at Boston, the Continental Congress promotes all these people above him, and they're all incompetent. They don't know what they're doing. So John Stark gets annoyed at this, and he eventually resigns his commission and goes back to New Hampshire. And when it's clear that the British have this big invasion, and there's no one who can stand before them, the people of New Hampshire realize that they have one person who can stand before them, and that's John Stark. So the Speaker of the House for New Hampshire, I want to say his name's like John McCurdy or something like that, he stands up before their Congress, and he's like, I will pledge everything that I have to get behind John Stark, essentially. So basically the people, and after all of these losses of the Continental Army, the people had lost a lot of their fighting spirit. They're like, they're a bunch of losers, they don't know what they're doing, they're not going to beat the British. But when they heard that so Seth Warner like appealed to the New Hampshires, I think I already said that, for support from this invading British army. And then the New Hampshire people finally get their shit together, and then they elect John Stark as a general. And then all of the people in New Hampshire like rally around John Stark because he's got such a great reputation as a leader, and they only want to fight under him, not under all these other incompetent people elected by the Continental Congress. And so the condition of his commission is that he's not subordinate to the Continental Army or the Continental Congress, essentially. So he is a general just of the people of New Hampshire, so he has no authority over him. He's the absolute authority of the force that he rallies, and that's why all the people rally behind him, because they know they're not going to be led by some incompetent bureaucrat, loser, aristocrat, whatever. So he starts marching down to intercept the British as they're on their way to Bennington, and he runs into a Continental a Congress general. And what is the first thing the general does? I think Schuyler is his name. He says, you guys need to go over here and go over here. And John Stark's like, nah, you don't know what you're talking about. We're going right for the invading army. We're protecting our land and our neighboring Vermonters. Vermonting. The Vermonters were Vermonting. And so the wind is really picking up. It's pretty great weather today on this first year of the wood snake. So yeah, let's get to the hero. So he's the hero of Bennington. So the British send this force to Bennington, which is basically the capital of Vermont at that time, because that's where the Commonwealth is, the capital of all of the Vermonters. And he sends his force of 1,492 militia out of New Hampshire, and he gets some more volunteers from the other states that realize they don't want to fight under these loser Continental Congress promoted people. They only want to fight under John Stark. And John Stark, his main thing that he writes back is everyone's arming themselves, and he's like, we need rum. We don't have enough rum. If we're gonna fight, we need rum. So he knows what fighting's all about back in the day. That they're a bunch of militia people, and they're standing up against this organized army that's trained and who's trained and drilled, and drained of their spirit simultaneously. But they're controlled by fear, essentially, by the British, by authority and fear. But it's a completely different force of the free people. And they are all there of their own free will, not by discipline, but by their own spirit. And he understands the need of alcohol to bolster men's spirits in times of confrontation and whatnot. So he makes sure that all of his soldiers get a good ration of rum before this battle of Bennington. And so basically the British are in like 3 different positions, or 4, and he organizes his people. Seth Warner's there, but the Green Mountain Boys aren't there yet, and organizes his militia with the plan of like coming around on all 3 sides and attacking simultaneously. And ultimately he routs the entire British force. They kill a couple hundred. They take like 700 prisoner and all of their weapons and everything, and it's a total defeat of the British force, this is the first total defeat of the British after Fort Ticonderoga. And it is a merger of the forces of New Hampshire and of Vermont, and some other volunteers as well. And this absolute victory then raises the morale of all the rest of the colonies, and they're like, look how great we are, we can win. And it's all thanks to John Stark. And without his leadership, the British would have sacked and pillaged Bennington, and then they would have been resupplied, and their entire force would have gone down to Saratoga when Washington was basically just on his last legs and just barely hanging in there. And the standing army is a whole nother thing. Like, Stark understood that it makes most sense to not have a standing army, but to have a well-trained militia, so that everyone would go back to their homes, and when the force is there to fight, then they'll come back again and they'll coalesce against that force. And if there's not a standing force to fight, then all the British can do is just punish the civilians, essentially. But what Washington wanted to do was to have like a standing army, and to keep all these people through the winter, and just like have all this deprivation and just loss and loss and loss. So Stark shows up with the Stark flag, which I had up until the last like month thought was the Green Mountain Boy flag. So the flag of this channel that you can see in the icon with the green on the bottom. Most of the flag is like forest green or green, and then so it would be the icon of this video will be the Stark flag. So the Stark flag was most likely created by Molly Stark, Stark's wife, who was just like the heroine of just another hero of what an exemplar woman in this colonial time was. She oftentimes when he was away fighting, she was raising like 6 or 7 kids under the age of 9 or something, all by herself, and she had 11 kids, and she just an amazing woman, just an exemplar of how great women can be, and supporting her husband in the fight for freedom and raising their children and taking care of the home. And surely he wouldn't have been able to do what he did without Molly Stark. But certainly the flag is basically, I think, was just a creation of Molly Stark. So the Stark flag It had, I think it had his name Stark on the flag, so I'm going to try to recreate that, but there's not a surviving example of the original flag, but there's a recreation, which will be the icon of this video, and that was his battle flag. That's the Stark flag. So it later became the Green Mountain Boy flag, and it's currently the flag of the Vermont National Guard and the Air National Guard, and the flag flies all around Vermont, and very few people know that it's actually the Stark flag. And one distinction is that the Stark flag is fringed in gold, which designates admiralty or maritime law, which designates basically absolute authority, which he was the absolute authority of his command at that time, and it also is relative to maritime law, of like the law of the water and the watersheds and whatnot. And so, yeah, and so later on he keeps on fighting with the Continental Army, and basically everywhere John Stark goes, there's victory, and where there's not John Stark, there's not a lot of victory. But then after Saratoga, he goes home and takes care of his family and stuff, because he successfully defended his people, his land of New Hampshire. And then the fighting moves down south. But at that time, after Saratoga, the French had joined on behalf of the Americans, and the British were basically, it was just a waiting game, and the British were defeated. And so he's the hero of the American people and the whole ideology of America. And then after the war, basically there splits these two different parties of political thought relative to the new colonies. And there's the Federalists, and then there's the Republicans. So the Federalists want to create a federal union and basically kind of replicate the form of British law largely. And the Republicans believe in a republic that's bottom up. The Federalists believe in more of a top-down thing, that these aristocrats are super smart and they need to rule over everyone else, and they need to have a standing army, and they need to have a standing government, all of which is counter to the ideas of the American Revolution, that you don't need a standing army, as proven by John Stark. The goat is about to cause havoc. Get off of there, Benedict. Come on. We didn't even talk about Benedict Arnold. Oh, but he was another completely incompetent person that the Continental Congress promoted, and led to all sorts of death and loss and unnecessary just idiocy out of his own hubris. And his only real positive things that he can show was when he was kind of teamed up with the Green Mountain Boys in the very beginning, and then after that he was just a complete failure, disaster in everything he did, just like most everyone else that was promoted by the Continental Congress, because that's what happens when you have a centralized government of like bureaucrats and aristocrats who are separated from the actual people, and who think they're better than the people and that they need to rule over the people. And the idea of a standing government generally is antithetical to the liberty of the people, just like a standing army is antithetical to the liberty of the people. So the basic points here that I'm making is all about John Stark, is about the flag, is about the ideology of John Stark. The Federalists, after the war, they create this Cincinnatus Society, which is named after a Roman general who, just like John Stark, was basically like a farmer, and in the time of need, he's called up and he leads the people to success, and then after he prevails, he retires to his farm. So the Federalists are a bunch of posers, and they want to be like John Stark, but they're not like John Stark, but they name themselves after a person who's really, John Stark is the actual Cincinnatus, and the other guys are basically the British subversion. And then in like 1809, John Stark writes to the Historical Society of Bennington, warning them about the Federalist Society, and that they're basically a bunch of British spies laying in wait to just recapture everything on behalf of the British. But it's really on behalf of the Rothschilds, who control the British at that time, and the British are just their enforcers, essentially. And so the first two presidents Washington and Adams were both Federalists and maintained these kind of Federalist ideals. And then when a Republican finally gets in charge, Jefferson, and Stark approves of the Republican and warns in 1809 that the Federalists and the British are laying in wait and they're conspiring and they're well organized and that they are the true enemy, the domestic enemy of the people. And sure enough, 3 years later, after Madison beats Clinton, Clinton being like a New York mayor and British puppet, just like the modern Clintons, or yeah, both of them basically, Rothschild puppets. And so when the Federalist guy loses and the Republican Madison wins, then the British invade in 1812, working with their local spies, and they sack and burn the capital of the new American Union. And even the whole sort of new constitution that they created after there was a confederation of states, and then they redo the whole constitution, and that's when they put George Washington in control. It's all basically like a British conspiracy. And then the way that they write history, and the victors always write the history, so they promote into this like this hero mythological symbol of Washington and Adams and these other people, but really they were just they're not the real Americans at all. John Stark is, and then the other Republican people like Jefferson and Madison, they are representing the true ideals of America. And so, yeah, the basic idea of Vermont, and then New Hampshire, and then the Stark flag. And so Starksboro, founded in like late 1700s, is named after Stark because the people here knew how great he was, and it takes a long time in history to erase someone in history. And the Federal Union wants to erase the story of John Stark, the hero, and also erase his flag, the Stark flag, that no one even knows is the Stark flag anymore. They think it's the Green Mountain Boys flag, and then they created a whole nother Bennington flag to erase the Stark flag. So there's a whole bunch of nefarious things to rewrite history to make sure that the U.S. that survives stays under the control of the central bankers that controlled the British, essentially. And the fundamental ideology of America is the power of the people, their right to self-determination, their right to create their own state out of territory claimed by other states, because the right comes from the people who are upon the land, not from some top-down pre-existing thing that says you have to abide by our authority. And so here at Castle Stark, I am keeping the history, the true history of the hero of Bennington and of all of America, and he's the hero of Vermont and of New Hampshire, of John Stark. And the flag of OG Foundation is continuing. The one difference in the OG Foundation flags, instead of the 13 colonies in the 13 white stars in the blue canton in the top left, there's the one star that represents Of-Allodium, which is an ideology of the same ideology that is the revolutionary ideology of America, that the people need not overlords. The people, it's a one nation under God, not a nation under a government, but the people have the absolute right to their property, and they need not subject themselves to any other people or any other government. And so in this rough weather here, I'm going to wrap up this story now. So now you know a good bit about John Stark, you know about the Stark flag, and you know why this castle is named Castle Stark. And there's also the Admiral Stark Rangers, which is a ranger force here in protection of Castle Stark, also obviously named after General Stark and his history of the founding of the Rangers. And it's called the Admiral Stark Rangers because there's in the maritime law, the flag fringed in gold, and the position of the leader of the castle Stark is the admiral. And we've created our own state here, which is a completely lawful thing to do, and it's in alignment with the fundamental ideologies of Vermont and of America. And I think that about wraps it up. Hopefully this has been an entertaining story, and also, more than that, educational. And it gives even more context as to what I'm doing, and maybe some other people will have a little fire in their spirit in alignment with the great Jehovah and the way that people are supposed to be living in nature under God or Jah, and not under people, not with government as their God, not with these false idols that religion will promote and that government will promote, but actual historical heroes, and promoting them and keeping them alive in the minds and the hearts of the people. And so Molly Stark will also be honored in this next build year. I'm not going to tell you all about it, but she's going to be honored. And I'm going to keep alive the history of John Stark here at Castle Stark, just outside of Starksboro. And that's the end of the story.